Well, I think the Seattle soccer scene was pretty meek and maybe pretty minuscule in terms of any kind of global adjectives or adverbs. It was a startup, a few, uh, Irish guys and a couple of German guys and a fledgling youth soccer program. Seattle Pacific, which Seattle Pacific College at that time, sister school of the school back in Michigan where I was coaching and being dean of students, wooed me out here, and it was just, I don't think they had won a game. Or maybe if they had, it was against an academy someplace. And of course, here's the big guy coming from the East, from the soccer culture, where instead of law school, we wound up winning championships in Chicago and in Boston and then back in Michigan. And the president from that school came here and basically continued to press until I came here. The first season was 0-7-3. A big time guy from the East. And we had a grumpy step down in the basement, and I would sit there every single day after practice and so on. But it then led to kind of looking at what was going on in what was known as the Western Collegiate Soccer Conference or something like that, sort of an anomaly of sorts, where half the teams in the league, well, there were 6 of them, you had to play each of the other 5 twice, so we had a 10-game season. And found out later on that most of them had players that weren't even in school. Some of them were guys off the ship, some were from foundries. So at the end of that season, which was also speckled with weekend trips all around the state to meet with parent groups to help get their clubs sorted. I had a little pamphlet, 39 pages, called A Little Help for My Friends, about a 12-game season outlined in terms of day-to-day practices. And effectively, it was just kind of the missionary going from here to Spokane and Vancouver and all around the place. Family was always wondering, where are you going? Well, we're going to try to get soccer going. And then by the next season, after a big-time meeting over at Washington in the spring, we had the Northwest Collegiate Soccer Conference, which I served as commissioner, founder, commissioner, whatever, for the next 22 seasons until NCAA got theirs going. But the whole picture was really kind of bleak at the time, and it was local stuff. I was part of the 2-division men's league. There were 6 teams in each with bakers and candlestick makers and Boeing workers, and yet it was a thriving scene in terms of soccer aficionados. We all really wanted to see it go. The whole waterfront of soccer from A to Z was somewhat infant in terms of how it was being developed. It was just a passion, mostly by the engineers at Boeing who had come from various ports around the world and also brought the love of the game with them. Obviously, the world's game was now taking root here. And there wasn't a whole lot of structure to any level of the game. I mean, the fact that we had 2 men's leagues playing down at Interbay in the mud every Sunday, with pretty good crowds, by the way, was some indication that there was a heartbeat. It wasn't as if everything has got to be created out of plastic or dough. And I think those first 2 or 3 years were simply missionary years. We all joined together. Nobody was vying for recognition. There was no push to be socially higher than the person next to you. We were all kind of pulling the same oars, and it just kind of opened and developed on its own. Okay, you be the secretary. Okay, so I'm the secretary, and guys are wandering around Robin's house drinking beer, and I didn't even close the minutes by saying, and the meeting was adjourned. I said people wandered around the house until the meeting just sort of dissolved. Well, Boston was historically more embedded with structure and organizational formula. I did create a conference there, the New England Collegiate Soccer Conference. So I had a little bit of previous experience in structuring something, even though I wasn't looking to say, oh, I'm going to do this. It was desperation. It was basically get some outline to the activities that we're involved in, and then you just saw things begin to develop and you add another step. For instance, in the Northwest Collegiate Soccer Conference, before we were done, we had every soccer playing activity at the college level. We had club teams, we had women's teams, we had men's club teams, we had community colleges. I can remember when Kingsley, the commissioner of the community colleges, called when they says, "Can we run our own?" I said, "Can you ever?" I mean, obviously that was one of the great discoveries, that once we got things rolling, it's kind of like creating another satellite operation instead of saying, "Oh no, you all have to be at home base." It was great when the NCAA came along with their divisional structure, because in the previous to that it was only college versus and university. So when I was in Boston, there were more traditional cornerstones and foundational principles governing all kinds of activity that we played off of. So it was easier to put things in place there because they already had, the Ivy League had its programs. There were, athletic directors and presidents on the East Coast were saying, "Damn it, now we gotta have women's soccer," stuff like that. So there was sort of that activity, and that those concepts were part of an evolving thing, but they were a little bit ahead of what we did out here. I think once we got going, the Northwest then began to surpass tons of other geographical areas across the country, and became a kind of prototype for some schools that said, "Hey, well," because I used to get calls all the time, "How do you do this? How did you put this in?" The Southeast Conference, the Sunshine State Conference, the Northeast Conference. We were sort of sentinels to help some of those people get going. Well, Eddie, I first met in the kiosk down at Interbay when I had landed here. My family came out by plane. The storage truck was here, and the moving truck. And I asked the neighbor lady where there was a soccer field, and she said, "Soccer? I don't even know. What are you talking about?" She says, "There's a play field down here." So I went down to Interbay, and there's a guy stomping out the lines because it was all mud. And there's a little kiosk beside the field where the Interbay Stadium is now. And in that little kiosk sat this guy, and I went over to him, and he was just kind of a gruff guy, and said, "Eddie, my name's Eddie Craig." And I'm, "Okay, hi Eddie, I'm Cliff McCrath," and that didn't impress him. And around comes this guy, and he stops. And I said, "Hi, I'm the new soccer coach at Dean of Students of Seattle Pacific." And he's bouncing his head back and forth because he's going to referee the game that's coming up. And he said, "I'm Michal Orion." And I said, "Well, I've never heard of him." "Well, Mike Ryan," he says. So I said, "Well," he said, "I coach at the University of Washington." I said, "Well, no." I said, "The only thing I know about soccer in the Northwest is what my coach back said, who was the head of the committee. He says this wild Irishman kept yelling at him to put him in the tournament, and so they finally did, and they went down to San Francisco and got beat 16-0. Well, steam's come out of it. "Well, let me tell you a thing about that." He said, "We played at West Seattle the night before, and we were late in the play. They lost our luggage. We had to play in street shoes and T-shirts with on it. We had to borrow some shoes from San Francisco." And of course, that was my introduction to Mike Washington and the beginning of a lifetime friendship, because from that point on, of course, all those other things started to sort of fall in place. But that was, Eddie Craggs was the guy. And then, of course, he told me about his son, who was a great referee. And I never called his son Whitey like everybody else in the world did. I called him George, just because I wasn't going to buy into the Whitey concept, which nonetheless was real, I think. I did say to Whitey one time, now I'll call him Whitey, "How come you never leave the center circle?" And he says, "They'll be back." Well, Mike, first of all, I think they all shared the same gift. Almost every person that I encountered and developed a long-term relationship with and gave eulogies to some of at their memorial services was their passion. I mean, these people, when they were born, there was a soccer ball with a stitched, laces in it, no 32 panel balls, but they were in their crib. And these guys all shared that passion, which now I was the stepchild to begin to experience and enjoy and share. But Mike, Mike Ryan, he was here 50 years, he still couldn't speak English. And his name in Irish is Michal Orion, so I always called him Michal. So Mike Ryan at University of Washington clearly was really a trailblazer. He was the first unofficially, but officially women's national team coach. When Governor Booth Gardner's Cosmos team were, I think that was the name, were providing a lot of the early stalwarts in the women's game. He was a great teacher. He obviously produced great teams at Washington, many of the first teams obviously being from the boiler room and the ships. There were the two German guys, Hans Schreiber and Karl Hans Schreiber and Karl Gross and his wife. Jack Goldingay, who was, one of those players, Robin Chalmers. There were Cor Vandermeer over in Spokane was obviously, he's a legendary guy that was so meek and kind, but he had great insights into soccer. And those people were sort of Mike Washington, who went over to Eastern Washington to coach in college, and I think has coached up until just the last couple of years. Great mind in the game, very good teacher. Walter Schmetzer Sr., and his boys, of course, Brian, who was probably one of the best, if not the best, American player back in his college years, so he went straight to the pros. And his brothers both played. Andy and Walter Jr. were excellent players. Casey Keller. These kids came to our camp. The camp got started in self-defense, so. Yeah, but those were just some of the key guys. I think the challenge is the same kind of challenge any sort of a fledgling idea or company or whatever, putting seeds in a garden. The challenge was to put structure in place, to put some sort of meaningful organization together that lacked the usual drive you know about when somebody wants to get their name in lights. Nobody gave a rip about who is doing what. I mean, people became presidents because somebody said, okay, you be the president. When I started the conference, every year there was a push to make me the president. I said, no, I'm the only full-time soccer guy in any Northwest college except Lewis and Clark down in Oregon. And everybody else was, coming in at the end of the day to coach a team. So from the commissioner's standpoint, we had an operational base. The Seattle Pacific and my office as Dean of Students gave me secretarial support and so on. So it wasn't even, well, let's have another meeting and plan something. It kind of just was, oh, there's another bubble, and you get a phone call and say, okay, I'll see you this weekend. And then you go and meet with parents. It probably was more loosely bound together by just an idea and a passion than any other startup idea that eventually became a 12-story building or IBM or whatever else. It just was like, no thought at the end of the day was what we'd accomplished. It was, okay, what's next? Well, I don't think any of those people, including yours truly, ever thought about time cards. I don't think anybody was ever, I don't think there was half a second of thought about, what we were doing in terms of recognition or in terms of the welfare, the being paid for it. We were involved. I think it's like the world game. It's like anything else. Sometimes the exterior absorbs you and everything you have, and you don't go home at night and say, why am I doing this? Because even the setbacks were stepping stones. There weren't really heavy blows where you come home and say, brother, how do I get out of this? I don't remember any of those people at any level ever saying, boy, I wish I could get out of this. It was always, how do we get more help? How do we involve more people? And that, I think, was the sort of, that was the boilerplate, the boiler in the basement fueling the heat of the game, the heat of our activities. It was now build the soccer program at Seattle Pacific. It was Arnie Eistrauts was an AAU guy that was doing the best he could here, but it was really kind of a fledgling, almost somewhat anemic, not because he wasn't the right guy, but because there was no footing financially. When I came, the president said he wanted a national soccer power. I said, well, I can't do that. He said, well, you've done it every place else. And I said, well, I can give you a national program. I can't guarantee the power. And he said, oh, that's what I meant. And I said, what's the budget? He said, we don't have any. I said, well, can I raise money? And he says, there's the door. So from that time until I left, there was about $16 million worth of revenue that we produced in a variety of ways. So. Probably the best snapshot of that early mob was a combination of passionate aficionados of the game and curiosity seekers. The first team I had out here was composed mostly of kids that I sent a memo to every male student at Seattle Pacific inviting them out to a game named soccer. And we had 70 kids show up. It was just me. There were no other any assistants, 70 kids up at Queen Anne Bowl. And so I put them in grids and so on, and we eventually pared it down. One year we had the varsity, and then we had two teams in the state league. We had the Nickerson Street Kickers and the, what was the other one? Was the Enchiladas, or because we had a few Mexican kids on it. A quick way to say is we didn't belong on the field with anybody else under the banner spelled soccer. I mean, every place, even locally, that we went to play, I thought we were the country boys that, you know, were finished their milking and they're putting the hay for the cows and showed up to the local dance, you know, without dancing shoes. I mean, I have said, and it probably needs to be really studied, that we won 4 or 5 national championships with kids that nobody else wanted, but there were kids on each of those teams that everybody wanted. And why they ever came to Seattle Pacific, where we had no scholarships in the early days, I think part of it, if I listened correctly, was that we did build a national program. We were known as the team on the go. Soccer America one time featured us as the team on the go, where we went any place we could go that people would take us. We'd play everybody at any level. Division I, later it became Division I, university level. So we would play, if they agreed to play us, we didn't care whether it was Indiana or Harvard or, you know, Prickly Heat Tech, we would go and play them. We had a golf tournament that started, we ran that tournament for 10 years. That in the early days just paid the bills, and then suddenly we started getting sponsors. We used to have a signed sponsor for each hole that was $1,000. And then one day I got the idea, why not sell forums? So I started selling forums. So we had $72,000 in the bank before we had the first tee, before we teed off. And we usually had full subscription and charged each golfer $250. And then I would send fundraising notes to everybody that I could find. This was before you had a contact list. Today we probably raise $1 million if we used our contact list. But and then I would go and speak, and then the camp would, in those days, was a couple thousand kids every summer, had a surplus, and the surplus went to pay for assistance and for, you know, for travel and things of that nature. For some reason, in a moment of weakness, the marketing people from Adidas and then later Diadora came to me and said, you know, we'd like to have you endorse our company and endorse our product. And I said, okay, fine. And then I had a couple of secretaries that were very wise in how to put it together. So it got to the place where when Diadora came along, it was a joke. Diadora Day, have a Diadora Day. What's Diadora? We had Adidas, we had Puma. We had some of the big names. This is before Nike really became prominent, before Nike got into the soccer business. And effectively, I had to make 10 speeches a year for Diadora around their various worlds. And in exchange for that, I've got uniforms for everybody, free of charge, shoes, everything, the whole 9 yards. The only thing we did was charge the kids for the lettering. So each kid would have to pay but he got bench jackets and shoes and 2 uniforms and you name it, and maybe a flower to go with it. So that got us into the sponsorship world, and that opened the door to funds. And there was even a few shekels for me that basically still got eaten at pretty quickly in terms of hosting, dinners and things of that nature. If I were standing back a little distance and looking in, certainly looking in past any suggestion of social recognition, that it was our schedule, when kids knew that they could travel from coast to coast and border to border. It was obviously the gear, because kids in those days were really impressed with the ability to have a whole package of gear that looked good. It was always well designed. It was playing competition that was really beyond their reach and beating a lot of them. I think we played pretty soccer at times, but it's desperation. It's life. Growing up in Detroit, the goal was to get across the street without getting killed. Wasn't doing it so you could get your name in the paper. And I think it's like Dean Smith said about the UNC basketball, when he said, I listened to my players, and then he said, then we'll do it my way. Well, I'm the last guy to sit around and worry about taking credit, but obviously our guys came into a system, and I think the unique part of the formula, Peter Hattrip would say it best, he was allowed to be Peter Hattrip, but he did it within the framework that the rubber nubber had put on the grease board. Threadbare adages about winning isn't everything, but it's way ahead of what's ever in second place. The Newt Rockne, the Vince Lombardi, you name the names of the guys that could, Woody Hayes even, if it comes down to it, slug the guy going by you and lose your job. I think it's just something that grows up with you. You realize that, the guy, what
did it look like?
I think sometimes it looked pretty frenetic, pretty scattered, pretty wild, like a back alley fight.
What did you yell from the sidelines?
Next man, next man.
What is next man?
Next man means that if you go into, first of all, the guy closest to the man with the ball is the number one defender. So we put pressure on him, like the Germans Getterling or whatever that fancy word is for pressuring up high. So he goes flying in there to try. And the key phrase to take with you is shut down, don't knock down. If you knock them down, they get a free out. So we had things like that worked for us. Instead of the Neymar principle, the knocking down and falling down, go and shut them down. If they beat you, the next man gets you. Because you are worrying about getting the ball past the number one defender, but the support guy is right there, and instead of him worrying about covering someone else, that's the balance guy. So we had the right concepts. Number one defender is the pressure man. Number two is the support man. Number three is the balance one. And if you're 2 against 3, then your balance guy's got to really be on his game. He or she have to really know where to shift when something happens up front that doesn't work. But the pressure guy, the forward, you got to, so whoever's there. So forwards don't just run back after they miss a shot. The forward has to J back and become one of those second or third men to get the ball back. And I think it's just like when a fly lands. I'm not the kind that brushes. I want to smack that fly. You have no right being on my shoulder and on my arm. Mosquito, you're dead. And I think the same thing, I don't know, I guess it came from blowing my fingers off and realizing I don't have to go under a table with a sock the rest of my life, and I can thank my mother for that. So you're in the game. You better not come home if you didn't succeed. Well, one year our home game was in 8 different venues. And in fact, we were in every postseason playoff after 1970. So 71 on, we were in every one in the 70s. In the 80s, we were in all but 2. And the one we missed early in 82, we had the strongest team at the end we'd had in any previous 5 or 6 years, but that's another political issue. And then, of course, we were in 4 consecutive national championships in 83, 4, 5, and 6. And then in 89, we stubbed our toe and had our struggles too. But the early years before we found the money for the stadium, we basically one time we were playing a playoff game at Newport High School, and we had to wait for the band to get off the field because they had band practice. It was football, junior varsity football, and the band before we could get on. We had the opposing team from Arizona here to play in a postseason playoff game, and we had to wait till the band leader got off the ladder and got the band up before we could warm up. So it was like, where is home? The first years before the Murdoch Corporation came through for us in the late 90s. Sometimes we didn't even know it. When we were getting ready to go to Florida for the 1970 championship, in a downpour, we got Lakeside High School to practice one last time before we went, only if we promised to buy them new goals. In those days, a set of goals cost about $700. So there we were in the pouring rain, which isn't going to get us anyplace, and we're practicing. And we gathered together after and tell them when to meet at the airport the next day. And that's our practice field. And then when we went down to play at North Ridge one year, we practiced for 2 weeks in the gymnasium at SPU, and guys were relegated to going down and pedaling in the sauna for fitness purposes because it was a snowstorm forever outdoors during that time. So we didn't, going to home games was like going to a homeless shelter. Sometimes we met at the gym to find out where we're going to practice the next night. Literally said, where are we going to go? We don't know, because sometimes it wasn't known until maybe 3 in the afternoon or so. And one of the reasons we started practicing at night, it gave us more time to find out where we were going to go. You know, you've heard the story of raising funds or starting a worldwide thing on a napkin in a restaurant. Well, it was on a napkin at 11:30 at night at 13 Coins Restaurant up on Capitol Hill or up in Bourne. It didn't hurt that the person I was meeting with was the executive director of a multi-million-dollar foundation who happened to be the father of 2 of our players. So that wasn't such a big genius move. The genius move I had was to go back east to my pal back there who invented a computer company who gave us a lot of money over the years. And I presented a $5,000 hardback pamphlet proposal for a new stadium that involved digging down and getting a water pumping system behind the gym because the water table from the canal was only 4.5 feet deep. And we're having a bowl of soup, and he said, well, this is a little bit sophisticated, but too sophisticated. In other words, this is a big proposal. Well, that got us our usual $50,000, $60,000 in stock that we used for travel and so on, and that the rest of the athletic department used as well, because we only got a little portion of ours. And so when I got home one night around midnight, I got a phone call from the interim president. Maybe he was president at that time, Kurt Martin. He said, well, I knew you'd probably still be up, but he said, I just got back from a trip, and I thought you'd like to know that we just received, on my desk was a letter announcing what is the largest single gift we've ever gotten in the history of Seattle Pacific, which is for your stadium, which is $2 million. Out of which came $200,000 to build the practice track for Foreman Track, since we were going to use that to widen the field, which had meant putting water ducts in over by what is now the golf course, which was an old sewage dump, and they had to pump the water out, and it would have been an excellent. So that field at Interbay is 120 long, but only 70 yards wide, which is legal, but it's not optimal. But I guess we were just nomads. I guess the best word I can use is, but nobody really complained. I mean, we had one guy that when we were at Memorial Stadium all those years always ran from here to there for fitness, Bobby Brook. He never rode. The rest was got in cars and went and came back, but he would put a ball under his arm and run over and go up 12 steps, and then he'd run home afterwards. Well, we so stymied them in terms of playing what then became known as a zone defense without ever trying to capture the ball, that once you upset their rhythm, and that's what somehow clicked in my brain, a God-given insight at 4 in the morning, that if you upset their rhythm, if you let them play, they're going to kill you. If somehow you can disturb how they play, which obviously was just to put a shifting pattern of people. And part of that whole thing came from Jimmy Gabriel, who was the original tutor for me in channeling, the idea of channeling the players instead of diving in and so on. And so that whole thing, and I said to the guys before we went over the half mile to the campus from the Ramada Inn at the Miami airport, I said, now the fans are going to get upset, I'll take care of them. Sure enough. But I said, if we can keep them for an hour like this, we might have a chance. Well, it didn't take an hour. 17 minutes in, Alabama and A&M were just yelling at each other, give me the ball. And they weren't understanding how they weren't getting in, already scoring 10 goals against us. And the fans said, come on, Seattle, play soccer. So I went over to the stands. I said, I'm like a preacher. I said, yeah, you'd like us to get killed. You go to stock car races to see somebody have an accident. I said, if we try to play with these guys, we'll get murdered. And they're stunned, including Ken Furphy and half of the pro coaches that were there. Furphy was the coach of the Cosmos at the time. And all of a sudden, yeah, it's almost as if they were a choir, not, yeah, maybe we should sing the same note. From that point on, everything we did, way to go, Seattle, way to go, Seattle. And of course, at 126 minutes and 47 seconds, in the third overtime, the game was won, and the most significant part of that is that the final score was 1-0, and they'd been averaging around 4 or 5 goals a game. So I think it was a tribute to, the underdog. It's a tribute to, the kid that comes from backwater Maine and doesn't have to apologize when he goes to the local dance as long as he can still dance. So I don't know. There's, a lot of metaphors and few hyperbole. Roger Bannister was not the first man to break the world's record for running the mile in less than 4 minutes. What Roger Bannister did is he broke the psychological barriers that the world had placed on human effort to basically be unable to run the mile in less than 4 minutes. And we know that that's what he did because subsequent to his breaking it up here in Vancouver, Dr. Bannister, of course, within 2 years, I think it was, some 60 different people had broken the 4-minute mile record. And now there's a guy, Steve, doesn't matter, I'd have to research it too, has run the mile in less than 4 minutes 106 times. So what happens is once the psychological barriers are broken and torn down, it's free will. It's let it roll. I mean, whoever's coming along. Well, obviously the '78 championship was a hallmark experience that is hard to beat based on what we faced to get there and how it happened. The other one would be the '93 semifinal, where we went down to Florida Institute of Technology, which was mashing teams. They were kind of the more they were not the Nigerian national team, but they were the Lead by the Sea England national youth team that were mashing everybody. Plus they had a crowd that was notorious for throwing golf balls at your keeper when the game's at the other end, or calling your name and you'd turn and they'd say your sister was from other than human origin because they saw your name in the pull, and they did everything they could to get a team off there. And our All-American goalkeeper, Marcus Hahnemann, had been ejected in the regional final. So now we got a 27-year-old Navy veteran that had been a backup keeper, never played in a game, Chuck Grenade, which I thought is kind of humorous. And Chuck was a great guy, became a great assistant. But he's going in goal against Florida Institute of Technology, and bingo, shortly into the game we score. A little later we score again, and then just before half they scored a couple of times. And I went out on the field, put my arm around Chuck as he's coming with his head down. I said, I want to thank you for letting those 2 goals in, because now I don't have to make that stupid 2-0 halftime speech. He thinks, what's going on? So then 75 minutes or so in the game, we score the go-ahead goal, and we think it's going to work. And then I guess in last second desperation, they kick a ball in, and Richard Sharp had, I think, got 5 assists in that game, and bingo, the ball goes in. In those days, you had to play 2 15-minute overtimes, full supplements, then you go 2 15-minute golden goal, and then penalty kicks. Well, 9 minutes into the game, they're ahead 5-3. And at the end of that first one, we got 2 minutes. I said, okay, if nothing changes, and I always believed you go broken generalities, so if I just said, if you don't score, I just said, if nothing changes, 5 minutes in, we'll pull Chuck, put his jersey on. James, our All-American center back, his twin brother was our leading scorer, Jason Dunn. And we couldn't get him in for 7.5 minutes because the Secretary of the Rule wrote a stupid rule that you could only substitute on your throw-ins. And we didn't get a corner kick, whatever. And then with 1 and 30-some seconds left in that last overtime, if we don't score, we're done. We got a guy, we just go ugly, just throw it in there and scrap for it. And James is about 40 yards up the field, and ball comes out to him, he bangs it back in, and they walk it around, and of course the guy crosses, and then Travis Cannell scores the 4th goal. Clock stops, 1 minute, 1 second, and we're looking at it. And so now the next time that it happens, the ball comes back to James, and he can't kick it this time, so he heads it over top, and little 2-iron Nate Dalagon pops it into their right back area, and the right back's coming to kick it. Well, the crowd, as soon as he headed it, starts counting 15, 14, 13. I turned to my assistant coach and said, I didn't think they were supposed to start counting till 10. And he's looking at me like, you know. And so the guy's coming to kick it, and then from right midfield, 60 yards away, came Jonathan Swanson. I used to say Jonathan, who was a brother of David on our team, was not a soccer player, he was a musician. You take him along when you want to be alone. I mean, he was just basically a great kid. But somehow he remembered that in desperation, forget where you are, just go and make sure we keep the ball. And the guy, instead of kicking it and clearing it, means the game's over. Jonathan put his foot up, and the guy made the most beautiful cross you've ever seen in your life. And Jason's at the top of the D, and the crowd's kind of 6, 5. It hits his chest on 4. We're looking over his shoulder left. He takes a volley shot. And we're thinking that's one that could go in, but we never have to debate it because a lead by the C defender put his foot out, deflected it, goes in, 0-0, 1-0, 0-0, game tied 5-5. And of course, FIT say, no, ball's not good. And the referee says, no, it's a good goal. So we go 2 overtimes, and my goalkeeper goes, so we got to get Chuck back. I say, he's not ready for prime time, so we're going to leave James in. So we left James in for that next 2 overtimes, and then kept him in for the penalty shoot. If I had to do over again, I'd have put Chuck in, and we probably would have won it earlier. But in the 13th round, after Richard Sharp sent his ball over the Atlantic someplace, Nate Dalagon just iced it and put it in, and the penalty kicks were 10-9 in our favor. So the game over, and we went into the final game 2 nights later against Southern Connecticut. It was like watching your shirt wrinkle. It was so boring. It was a 1-0 game. First of all, as a byplay, I was at college days, got involved in camp. So I was in camp in New Hampshire and in Maryland for 13 summers, including the first 2 I was here. I flew back 10 weeks of the summer. I'm in camp. I'm everything in camp. Coached several sports, in charge of lots of things. So camping became that because one of my housemates in my junior year says, hey, we're going to camp this summer. Well, camp for me, it was detention, growing up in Detroit. So wait a minute, I'm not going to camp. Well, it's turned out this was a camp that was the kind of camp, say there's 200 and some alone in New England of camps that people send their kids usually for the whole summer. So I had the background, taught by the actual guru of camping, Miles Strodel, passed away several years ago. And he was the camp guy. And came to Wheaton to recruit people for the summer because he had graduated from there. And instead of going to play baseball for the Cubs, he went back and became a headmaster of a private school, Lexington Christian in Boston, and then up in New Hampshire all summer. So I had the camp background. Well, about the time that, about the end of the second year, Mike would call me, by the way, Mike Ryan would call me every single night at 11:30 and he'd talk for 45 minutes. And my wife tell you to put the phone down, go downstairs and get a Coke and make a sandwich and come back up and say, mm-hmm, and he'd still be talking. And basically you couldn't understand it, but it was all about soccer. And then all of a sudden, he called one day, and we're both experiencing the same thing, is that people were coming in our door as soccer started to move, and perhaps it was in relationship to our evangelistic missionary work, because now more and more parents were organizing clubs and following little scenarios. One guy was coaching a high school they said with my pamphlet in his back pocket. He'd pull the pamphlet out and say, okay, now we're going to do this drill. I was told that by his players, some of whom we recruited. And so now it's effectively becoming a distraction. People are coming in the door, and here's the quote. The quote was, I took my kid to soccer, and they said if I don't coach them, they don't play, and I don't know a damn thing about this game. So we started thinking about it and putting it together, and then Mike calls, and he's got the same problem. He said, I can't get any work done because all kinds of people coming asking to learn about soccer. So bingo, the idea hit me. Let's get him in one place. So we went up to Casey, which was still I think is owned by Seattle Pacific. And there's nothing but weeds, 5 foot high, cat o' nine tail stuff. So we got a farmer to mow the hay and built a couple little makeshift goals and had 30 kids and 4 coaches. And I didn't know, ignorance isn't stupidity, it's just lack of information. But somehow there was enough things that had happened that we made it a DBA, so doing business as Northwest Soccer Camp. I wouldn't put my name on it, that was not to be. And therefore, from the very beginning, it was an authorized body of literature and stuff. We filed papers, corporation papers, the next year, because we thought it was just it. We gleaned the food, that was it. I paid the coaches because some of them had to leave their work to be there for a week. And then the next year, parents were calling, you're going to do the camp again? I said, well, I guess so. So we had a week at the beginning and a week at the end, about a total of 200 or 300 people. And then by the next year, we had 10 weeks of 250 kids a week, because by then I had been the guy helping the Nordstroms put the first Sounders together and did the television. And so it was kind of a expanded recognition that somebody's involved in soccer. And then 10 years later, I was $250,000 in debt because we weren't charging anything. And the treasurer of the Board of Trustees of Seattle Pacific came alongside, and we got a loan. And he said, you got to start charging kids, which we did. And then effectively about 5 or 8 or 9 years later, we paid the loan all off and then started giving all the money to Seattle Pacific. Because, again, we needed a travel budget, and my budget was around $7,000, and it would get us from here to Tacoma for a game, and we were now the team on the go, and so almost every penny of that surplus always went to Seattle Pacific. They took that as a command, as a mandate, not just a suggestion. He said, you should look into soccer, look into soccer. By then, the NASL was going downhill and losing members, because the old NPSL and the USA got together in a federal court, and the judge says, you guys go and play while we figure this out. And of course, he was the #1 financial background of the NASL because his son hated football, and he owned the Kansas City Chiefs, and his son went to Southern University, I think, somewhere down there, and played soccer. So that was his motive for getting involved in soccer. So basically now he said, we're going to put Cliff in charge because we don't know anything about soccer. We don't know a damn thing about soccer. So I said, well, I can't work for you. Their acronym for their group, their holding group, was SPS, which is Seattle Professional Sports. And so I said, well, I can charge you real expenses, but there were 4 teams that made the playoffs of the 9 there. One was Toronto, New York, Dallas, and Philadelphia Adams, being coached by my buddy Al Miller, who was the first college coach to leave college and go to the pros, even though the Adams only lasted a couple of years. So I'm out there visiting with Al, go from there to, and the Adams beat Toronto. And there's this guy following me around the entire time there. I went across the New Jersey freeway to Howard Johnson's for breakfast, and this guy follows me, a big 6'3" or 4" guy, who, was the publicist for the Toronto team, later to appear in a different form. So then I go to Dallas, and Lamar takes me into this huge conference room and brings in Joe Eschel, who was his general manager and president. He said, give Cliff the book. So I sat there for 4 hours and wrote a 6-page pro forma for the new Seattle team. Brought it back, gave it to Walt, and Walt showed up in Dallas too, so he's there. We're hand clasping and shaking hands and so on. And I had it based on a perspective of 6,000 average fans paying an average price of $1.41, which includes city tax. Because we'd always brought teams like Tottenham and West Ham and so on in the summer, and we'd usually run about 5,000 or 6,000 people. So that's how I set it up. Well, of course, fast forward, I meet with Walt and give him this thing down at the China Harbor here. He's still smoking again, and I give it to him, and he brushes that aside, and he says, well, he said, we'd like you to do it. And I said, I don't think the league's going to last. He said, well, we'll give you a car. I said, well, I got a car. He said, well, we'll give you a membership at the Washington Athletic Club. I said, I am a member. My president signed me up so he could beat my back with racquetball. And then he put the money on the table. And to this day, if I'm asked, do I have any regrets? I think I probably do have at least one regret because I think that would have taken me through a few weeks of life. But anyway, I said, no, it's not going to do. And then I agreed to do television because it was for the station, not for the place, so I could still coach. And I didn't lose any eligibility. So I guess the big statement came at the end of that session with Dick and Walt when I said, there were 8 of us down in that room, why me? Walt says, you're the only one who could speak English. And of course, then Walt introduced Claudia to John Best because he was my pick for first coach. And that kind of got the team off and running. And then I worked with him and Jimmy Gable trying to put some players together from England. We had some good times over there. Well, John Best was obviously a very charismatic guy. He was the captain of the Dallas team and the vice president of public relations, because in those days they kind of took the best of the international player and blended them into some sort of a community program, and he was very good at it. I loved John. He wasn't a great coach. He was a great manager, and he had a great picture of how to do it. But he had a way of putting together the team of people, and Jimmy was the players guy. He had obviously been a great player, and effectively was the communicator. When we went over to England to recruit players, we had a great time, a fabulous time. We also connected with Harry Redknapp when we were there, and the 3 of us were like the 3 musketeers. All of us. That first game, of course, we played the first game of America on the road. I think it was in LA. And then we came home and we filled the stadium. There are 4 seats that had pigeon poop on it. You couldn't sell those seats up in the nosebleed section of Memorial Stadium. And they were roped off. Other than that, every seat was filled for that first home game, as I recall it. And then halfway through the season, we brought in 5,000 additional seats, some of which were up on the platform by the scoreboard, and some of which is in the VIP parking lot at the other end, over by the gondolas. And it was it was unbelievable. At the end of that season, the ownership group is, and I'm with them at a 7 o'clock breakfast at the Washington Athletic Club in the private room. And coming late to the meeting was Lloyd Nordstrom. And he came in and he didn't even sit down. He said, gentlemen, he said, I'd like to join you, but he said, I'm going to Mexico for vacation with my family. And all I have to say is this is the very best investment I've ever made in my life. When you think about it, the little group that started to grow and expand in those early 70s, that then it morphed into what became the love affair of the mid-70s and into the early 80s, which made Seattle one of the flagship franchises of the NASL, along with Minneapolis and Tampa Bay and New York, of course. But when you think about that, and then you think about the parents that were coming to get uh, camp experiences, and the kids that were teenagers getting camp experiences to learn how to play the game. All of those people now removed 30, 40 years are adults, and their kids have been playing since they got out of the cradle. So the facts are that whatever the exponential growth of family around a passion that was embraced by the people who were latecomers to the game was now innate within their very birth cycle. Here they are, they're born, and what are they doing? The first thing they do is playing soccer. I think if you go back to the sort of beginning cells, where the cells were multiplying with just the nucleus of the foreign guys with their passion in the game, and then the locals who were basically traditional stereotype families with baseball, football, basketball nationally and coming in here. And I think a lot of that was sort of the early Boeing engineer traffic we're bringing people in, is that once that next sort of tier of growth occurred, then from that point on it's just a multiplication. So every child that's born is already playing soccer. Probably there's a soccer blanket in the nursery at the hospital. And so soccer became sort of the invisible teammate accompanying each of those birth cycles, to the point where it was a slam dunk when I sat with Adrian trying to get him to throw his hat in the ring during the off years. And I remember him down at Leshai, we were having a latte, say, well, there's a little difference between losing a few thousand and a few million. And I remember saying, I don't have any money, but I'll find people, and for every dollar you lose, we'll get you 100, because it will go into rocket, it'll go into orbit, because all those people that were learning the game then are parents with their kids who have been playing since they got out of the cradle. Bud got involved in soccer because of his friendship with some of the early Sounders players who were on the east side, and some of them actually Tommy Jenkins' wife, I believe it was Tommy Jenkins' wife, was working as one of his secretaries. And so this kind of got him involved. And so he became a part of the men's league. And we actually played in Vancouver and Victoria, and flew up in his little private plane, came back one time with Jimmy and Tommy and some of those guys, white as sheets, because we were in an absolute horrendous thunderstorm coming down the straits from Friday Harbor or Vancouver, wherever we stopped to gas up. And the rain is pelting against the side of the plane, and these guys are smoking like crazy and saying, this is it. I'm laughing. And of course, Bud is he's the pilot. So he's he's going to land the plane, and which we did. But he really got really passion for the game. And he was playing. He wasn't a great player, but he was like a lot of adult players, just enjoying the game and motoring around. And then we sort of bonded together in the off season after the NASL collapsed. And then because he was trying to be talked into buying the Sounders, and I said, the league's not going to last. I was privileged to be part of his inner circle group, I guess, and I said, this league is not going to survive, so don't put your money in it. Well, then he did put some money in it, but he didn't. I said, don't tie your own personal assets to it, because you got to be able to have an out when this thing goes sideways. And then I went to Switzerland to work on in my sabbatical in February of '85, and while I'm there, I get a call from him and Jack Brand saying that they are going to pretty much fund the soccer program in between the collapse the year before and whatever comes next. So I came back and then kind of became the point man, trying to get competition for the FC Seattle, which was the name of my men's team that we played in tournaments up and down the coast, and we're the only one playing in those, Guatemala to Victoria, that didn't have a clubhouse. we just gave it FC Seattle, sounded like a good name. So we're trying to name the team that's going to take kind of the semi-pro route with some of the old Sounders guys. And in that meeting over in his office in Bellevue, Bud said, well, I like FC Seattle, but that's Cliff's team. And I said, you can have it. They take the name. It's just basically what we called ourselves to sound like we belonged with these other FC groups, FC Victoria and so on. And so that's how FC Seattle became kind of the banner under which that group began to play. And I went to LA and met with Siggy's team was playing the U.S. men's team. Alex Panagoulias was the coach. And I went to East LA Community College, sat on the bench with him. Then we went to the big gathering afterwards with ice sculptures and everything else. And Alex was smoking a cigar and just all heated up because he says, we got no respect. Look, at the boys are coming in their outfits, their training outfits in the back door. And here are these people in tuxedos with ice sculptures, and any place else in the world, they'd come in, everybody would be bowing down. They would be number one. They'd come in the front door. They're coming in the back door. We don't even have uniform. We don't have things to wear when we do. I said, we'll get you that. What do you need? And he said, what are you saying? I said, you come to Seattle and play us up there, play FC Seattle, and we'll clothe you. So when you go to the World Cup and you wherever you're going to go, you'll have, you know, jackets and ties and shirts and whatever. We won't buy you shoes, but. And he pulls a cigar out of his head, the ash fell on the floor, and he says, you'll do that? I says, give me 5 minutes. I go over to the payphone. I called Bud. I said, Bud, do you have your checkbook? He says, yeah. I said, get ready. We're going to put clothing in the backs of the U.S. team. That whole effort was kind of interesting because, first of all, I was the only rep from the state of Washington to go for 3 days in February, and I think it was 1987 in Chicago, to figure out how to get the World Cup to the United States. And we were sequestered there in the Hilton Hotel down on Michigan Avenue, and basically figured out how to make soccer the heartbeat sport of America. You know, the Dallas Cowboys were America's team at the time. We were trying to do that. And so effectively then I became kind of the instant, kind of like instant coffee person, that there's another group here and we need you to speak to them. So we're down in the private room at the Sheraton Hotel with the selection committee, which, you know, has the guy from Mexico, and that whole thing. Sepp Blatter's whole crew is part of the organization. And I got up and made the brief speech that said, what I want you to think about is the word consolidation. Is that, and the best I can explain it is that there's a coach in baseball way up in the upper corners of Maine near the St. Lawrence River that every week plays pepper with the kids that, you know, he wants to become baseball players. And then one day Babe Ruth gets talked into coming there. And his presence then consolidates every little gain that coach was and the other coaches were trying to work on, to the point where Maine became one of the great sources of Major League Baseball players because it was consolidated. I said, we have millions of kids playing this game in sandlots and all over the place, some organized, some not, just being there to kick the soccer ball. But we need the World Cup to consolidate the effort in America, to make America part of the world community. And the guy from Mexico, who had turned his plate over because he'd had too much to eat and he didn't want any more served, actually stood up and started, you know, kind of clapping like bingo, bingo. And because they were interpreting for him, he wasn't all that clear on the English side. And so I think that part of the early release, once we were told, and I was the World Cup ambassador for the Sprint Corporation, traveling all across the country trying to tell investors and partners of Sprint why they should spend $30 million as a partner, not just a sponsor. That was another level of money. And I used this consolidation theme all the way through that whole experience, trying to say that that the American kids needed the opportunity to join the world community and play the world's game with the same passion, vigor, and assistance from other people that knew how to help coach them. The 47, I was supposed to, after I got dared into playing soccer, which I saw. The first game I saw was 4 days after I turned out for the team as a sophomore in college. My high school or my college roommate was an All-American basketball player from Dallas, and he wanted to get in shape for basketball. He didn't know that he was going to wind up a two-time All-American goalkeeper. In those days, didn't do any running. They just stayed in their little box. And so I went to the barber to get shaved, which in those days I needed because I looked like a terrorist the night before the first game. And he said, "You the kid from Detroit?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I hear you're going to start at center halfback tomorrow," because there was an All-American, Paul Anderson, that graduated the year before. And by then I knew that the number 5 player was the best on the team, the fastest and the key to the whole team. And where'd you hear that? He says, "Your coach was just in here for a haircut and talking about this kid from Detroit." So he had a ritual where you'd get dressed except your shirt. And then he'd hand you the shirt all folded up and you'd open it. And of course, in those days, no substitutions. So if you were a substitute, every substitute was listed under the number 12, which they, in fact, in England, they just said "and other." So if Alan Ball, the right wing for England's 66 World Cup team, gets sick before the game, and I play in his place, I wear number 12. Everybody knows I'm not number 7. I'm number 12. I'm a substitute. So I fondle this thing as he has me. I finally open it instead of number 5, which I believed I was going to have, because in those days it was all numbered. It was number 47. And I'm stunned. The first thing I want to do is punch the coach and then go get the barber. And then I'm kind of distracted. And our right wing is Bobby Adol from Africa. He's unbelievable, All-American. He's putting on number 7. He's putting on 88. Our captain, Pierre Biscay, number 10, Paley's number was supposed to be put on. He's putting on 59. My brain is going crazy, and the coach says, "Gentlemen," he said, "we ordered our uniforms in February." This was September. He says, "They're still not here." They came from England in those days on ship. And he said, "So we're going to have to wear the leftover football uniforms." So I go dancing out in the field to mark this guy from Syria that played for the University of Illinois. And he says, "What is this number 47? So we beat him, and then afterwards I hadn't learned the Christian verities yet, so I go by. "So what do you think of this number 47 now?" And he was bamboozled. So when the new uniforms came, I refused to take it. By then I had started a culture of license plates and competition on how many 47s you could see. And then in February of 2002, the Pomona math department finally revealed that their 10-year search for the prime number of the universe was number 47. So that's the history of 47. Why it's the prime number of the universe, so there isn't any other number available. Well, there's a whole host of people, but the people that I genuinely look at as being, that leads me to say the fabric fits the cloth, and this may upset you, but one guy is a guy that was our SID for a quarter of a century, a guy named Frank MacDonald, who really knew how to take the little ink exposure that we might get and make it a banner type of exposure. So I don't think a lot of people think about that, and I know he wouldn't. He would really be upset almost if he heard that. But I look at him as one of those hallmarks in my life as a friend, but as a great professional. And then I look at some guys, Ken Olson, who started Digital Equipment Corporation, provided a great deal of early financing. Obviously, Lynn Swanson, Dr. Swanson, who was the executive director of Murdoch that got us our stadium deal. That whole cadre of brotherhood of Mike Ryan and those guys who let a, seven-fingered lunatic, come into their brotherhood. I would say those guys had a profound effect on me. Tons and tons of people whose kids came to camp, and a lot of those kids who came through camp, guys like Paul Barron, who came along from England and didn't minimize us. Bob Wilson, who asked me, "Where'd you learn your football?" because he thought I was a great passer. But then you look at the whole family of players that gave up a lot of probably opportunities to play for nothing, or at least play with scholarship support. Peter Hattrop has to stand out as one of the premier players that well, you could go on forever. Sergio Soriano, the Cuban refugee who came to our game in '77, said, "Coach, I come to you next year and we win a championship," and he did. Bobby McLaughlin, who grew up in our camp, started at Catholic University and came back and was the wizard of that. Steve Newman, back in those early days. A legion of friends. My son Steve, who chose to come to school at Seattle Pacific when I think he could have gone elsewhere, and he wasn't quite ready physically when he first came as a freshman, but who became my best friend on the planet, along with his sister, my daughter. Boy, I don't know, that's a tough question. I think you've stymied me here because this is the kind of thing where I'm driving down the road tomorrow and I'll think about 47 other people I could tell you about. But I think those guys come to mind right away.